Welcome back everyone to Formula 1 2020 and to your race review here at Portimao for the 2020 Portuguese Grand Prix. May I just start by saying what a race this was. I was so looking forward to our first ever race here at Portimao, and I think it's safe to say it didn't disappoint. I pray we come back here in the future. A sprinkle of rain, a little teaser in the early stages of the Grand Prix gave us some incredible, some of the best opening laps I have seen in Formula 1 for years. Absolutely awesome, meaning a non-Mercedes car led the Grand Prix. We had a couple of crashes, Hamilton going backwards, all a little bit carnage. The race itself had so much strategy, intrigue, but more importantly, today's race will go down in Formula 1 history. Spoiler warning up ahead, so if you've not seen the race, I would very much recommend watching the highlights, trying your best to get a hold of it before coming back to this review. If you are new, I hope you enjoy, and if you do, feel free to subscribe. But before we jump into today's race result, let's take a look at your grid for the Portuguese Grand Prix. And yesterday, for the 97th time in his career, Lewis Hamilton took pole position with his teammate Valtteri Bottas alongside him in P2. Max Verstappen would start on the soft tyres, Charles Leclerc alongside him would start on the mediums. What kind of impact could the Ferrari driver do in the opening stages? Perez was 5th, Alex Albon, not a bad job in P6. The two McLaren 7th and 8th, looking to try and go forward if possible. Gasly 9th and Daniel Ricciardo rounded out your top 10. Starting on the medium tyres and the alternate strategy, what impact could the likes of Ocon and Stroll do from 11th and 12th? On the 7th row of the grid, Kvyat and George Russell, my driver of the day from qualifying. What a lap from the British driver. Vettel all the way down in 15th, Raikkonen P16 choosing the soft tyres, the only driver in the bottom 10 to do that. Giovinazzi 17th, Grosjean 18th, Kevin Magnussen the only driver in the entire field to start on the hard tyres, and Nicholas Latifi rounded up your grid in P20. Right, spoiler warning out of the way, here is your result for the 2020 Portuguese Grand Prix. And yes, for the 92nd time, a record-breaking weekend, Lewis Hamilton claimed victory. What a season it's been, what a career this man has had. I cannot wait to jump into our discussion in the race debrief in a moment's time once we've gone through the results. But a real poetic day, I feel, for Lewis Hamilton, going back, really having to fight for the victory in the early stages. But come the checkered flag, not only did he claim victory, the fastest lap, but won the Grand Prix by 25 seconds. A ridiculous race, a dominant performance from our 6-time world champion. Valtteri Bottas tried his best, but after a successful start to the Grand Prix, fell behind his teammate, ultimately a long way off, and it was actually Max Verstappen who finished an impressive P3, was closer to Bottas than Bottas was ever to Lewis Hamilton. Another really impressive drive from Charles Leclerc put the Monegasque driver P4 again in 2020, but perhaps an even more impressive drive, Pierre Gasly P5. He had to work for it, a different strategy to some of those ahead, but really getting in the mix, getting his elbows out, especially with Sergio Perez. Perez tried his best to hold on to P6, but ultimately Carlos Sainz passed him on the final lap of the Grand Prix. Sainz 6, Perez P7. Esteban Ocon did a ridiculous 53 lap stint on his first set of medium tyres. Ultimately, his change to the softs late on in the Grand Prix didn't reap many rewards moving further up the field, but still got him in front of teammate Daniel Ricciardo. Ricciardo finishing 9th means 6 points isn't too bad for the Renault team. And for the first time since the Tuscan Grand Prix, Sebastian Vettel finally picked up a point in P10. A much better drive from Seb today. Just outside the point and after what I can only describe as a magnificent drive, Kimi Raikkonen can be very proud with P11. Perhaps more so, not necessarily scoring points, but the fact he was able to keep behind a Red Bull for so long. Alex Albon, not great today, P12. I want to talk about that in a moment's time, but he did manage to beat out Lando Norris, who had several issues of his own. George Russell in P14, a great drive, but we just know without more DNS, without more carnage, that Williams is never going to be able to reach those points. Giovinazzi 15th, Romain Grosjean with a 5-second penalty for going a little bit too wide into turn 1 in P16, ahead of Kevin Magnussen even with that penalty. Latifi 18th, Kvyat also got a penalty for track limits in P19. frustrating, and perhaps the driver with the most issues, most difficulties of the day. Lance Stroll, our only non-finisher in P20. I really enjoyed that race. I really did enjoy it. I knew I was going to like this circuit, but there was just something really magical about it. The opening stint was fantastic. I'm a sucker for strategy, and the fact that we had so many different strategies at play, I absolutely adored. I know it's not something all of you are interested in, but I always think it just adds that extra element of spice to a Grand Prix that we just miss so often in 2020 and modern Formula 1. The fight at the front was there in the opening stages, and certainly if the opening 20 laps of carnage continued through the entire Grand Prix, I think we would all walk away from this race absolutely buzzing, bouncing off the ceiling. It didn't quite pan out that way, and the closing stages did calm down a little bit. We had a great fight, several great fights actually, with Sergio Perez and several drivers within that midfield, but I thoroughly enjoyed it, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on in our race review and when we have our discussion for driver of the day. But the debrief then. We've got to start at the front. We've got to start with your new record holder for most Formula 1 Grand Prix victories, Lewis Hamilton. On paper, it looked easy, but I tell you what, in those opening stages, boy, was it far from easy. Hamilton, despite starting on pole, dropping all the way down to third place. Initially, not a bad start, managed to keep Bottas at bay, but just coming out of turn 7 at the end of sector 1, a little bit of a wiggle on the rear, Bottas was able to sneak up the inside. Only a few corners later, Carlos Sainz, who had a beast of a start, managing to pass Hamilton at the top of the hill, Hamilton going backwards, and it was Sainz who was then able to put the pressure on Bottas and take the lead of the Grand Prix. And now with a bit of hindsight, knowing that Hamilton has gone on to claim the record, I feel it's really quite poetic. I'm sorry if this sounds silly, but how awesome is it that the race where Hamilton beat the record, it was his former team, McLaren, the team that gave him his opportunity in Formula 1, that gave him a run for his money today, that really wanted to win. And yes, it didn't play out that McLaren were anywhere close to the victory, but there was a stage in those opening laps where McLaren really wanted to give Hamilton a go. And I don't know, I just feel that was quite nice, that it was Hamilton versus McLaren in this weekend of all weekends. But he was able to get back past Carlos Sainz once the rain had vanished, once those medium tyres had got up to temperature on the two Mercedes. A lovely move with DRS. DRS was quite powerful today, certainly helped by the tailwind in the early stages of the Grand Prix. He then had to close down Bottas. Initially struggled, or at least the gap was steady at about 1.5 seconds between the pair. But Valtteri couldn't manage the tyres. Really struggled to look after them, so much so Hamilton not only overtook Bottas with relative ease into turn 1, he then pretty much skated off into the distance, got a 10-second lead before Bottas did his stop. Bottas tried to do a bit of a sneaky strategy, just like we saw at the Tuscan Grand Prix. He wanted to go onto the soft tyre, do the opposite to Hamilton, which would have been fun. I think we were all slightly hoping Mercedes would mix it up a little bit, but they have been very clear. Pretty much since Bottas came into the team, there was going to be no unfair treatment on either side of the garage. It's why they didn't do it in Tuscany. It's why they didn't do it today. And from a fan perspective, yeah, it's quite frustrating that we didn't see that head-to-head fight push Hamilton just that little bit more. But from a team perspective, when you've got a 1-2 in the bag, when you've got a weekend where Hamilton can become the world record holder, you can understand why they were slightly more conservative than perhaps other teams would have been in that situation. Either way, I don't think Bottas was winning this race. Strategy, no strategy. Hamilton just in a different league. Bottas really struggling to put any kind of pressure on his teammate. 25 seconds is a huge chunk of time. There's lots of transfer rumours at the moment regarding a certain driver at Williams. Just wonder how this result today could play into the hands of a certain George Russell. Certainly a topic for another day, but the focus today shouldn't be on Bottas, shouldn't be on transfer rumours, it should be on Lewis Hamilton. 92 victories, a record I believe will never ever be broken, except by Hamilton himself, of course, that I am sure will be marching on his way to 100 poles and 100 victories over the next year or so. but fair play to him. Thoroughly deserves all the success. Everything he brings to Formula 1 is so incredible. Fair play to him. I'm going to have to move on. As much as I'd love to talk about Hamilton even more and really just take in this moment in Formula 1 history, we've got 9 more teams to get through. So for the rest of the debrief, I'm going to go through it team by team. And I think the next sensible place to go is Red Bull, because there's lots to talk about there, at least on one side of the garage. Max Verstappen, excluding what was just a carnage lap 1 for everyone, where Verstappen got in front of Bottas before turn 1, then slipped behind, went wide into turn 1, fighting with Carlos Sainz. It was just a bit mad for everyone, was that first 1 or 2 laps. Once he got back into a rhythm, got past Carlos Sainz, it initially looked, because he was on the soft tyres and the 2 Mercedes on the mediums, looked like Verstappen might be able to come back at the 2 of them, but it never really happened. Came in earlier than the 2 Mercedes, thanks to being on that alternate strategy, and we never really saw him again, really. It was just a very Max Verstappen-esque performance in 2020. Every race he's finished, he's been on the podium. That streak continues today. He just continues to boss it in that, what we kind of call the midfield, but we all know Max Verstappen is that level above the midfield. Trying to pressurise the Mercedes, was kind of more in a race with Charles Leclerc. Those two were almost in their own separate bubbles in this Grand Prix. So Max, great job once again. But it's that other side of the garage. And actually it was Verstappen who was almost fighting his teammate Alex Albon at the end of the race, but not for position, for being lapped. Alex Albon lapped. Not good. Really not good today. And it's something we've seen so often in 2020. And we didn't really see it in 2019, where Albon did alright in qualifying yesterday. Opening lap, dismal, but that's okay because so many drivers were. But you would expect him to come back through the field, and it just never really happened. And you just wonder where that confidence is gone. The driver we saw at Spa, at Sochi last year, making overtakes seemingly at every single corner under the sun, that confidence just isn't there this year. And today, a day where he really needed to make overtakes, really needed to make moves. We know that Red Bull car had pace. Look at Verstappen, who was closer to the Mercedes than he was the midfield. Why wasn't Alex able to do that? Of course, we will never know the questions, but it's quite alarming when you've got one driver fighting for podiums, fighting for victories, and the other one today couldn't get past the Alfa Romeo of Kimi Raikkonen. Sergio Perez, on the other hand, just want to bring in Perez for now, and we'll talk about his full race in a moment, out pretty much on the spot, it would seem, on lap 1 after contact with Verstappen. I agree that it was a racing incident, by the way. Contact between the 2 of them. Perez then, despite being dead last, able to go super long on that first strategy, overcut everyone, still do a second stop, and still finish way in the points, way ahead of the likes of Alex Albon. Albon also behind the likes of Sebastian Vettel today, who started 15th. Really not a great race from Alex Albon. There was so much pressure on his shoulders this weekend, and I can't help but feel that doesn't help. Red Bull just don't seem to make the situation any easier for their second drivers sometimes. I'm sure behind closed doors there's other stories going on, but we just know how ruthless that program is, and I just feel like that pressure is just getting a little bit too much for Alex Albon at the moment. If reports are to be believed, he's got one more race to turn it around. I'd love him to be able to do it. On the balance of probability at the moment, though, we've got a guy who finished P5 today who is in the form of his life. And when you balance that up, you've really got to just question who deserves the opportunity at the moment. And I would kind of like to see Albon go back to AlphaTauri and have a revival like Pierre Gasly. That would be really awesome to see, because at the moment, it just isn't working. I'll leave that there because I always feel dreadful when I talk negatively about drivers sometimes, but it just didn't come together for Alex Albon today. Ferrari we'll talk about next, because Charles Leclerc, a quiet race like Max Verstappen, went backwards initially at the start but made a couple of overtakes to work his way back forward, back past both McLarens it was, because Norris was in play at that stage of the Grand Prix. And pretty much from there, we never really saw him, and that's exactly what he needs to be doing, dragging this Ferrari to the big points, where they would like to be, where they hope to be, to capitalise on any mistakes from the front 3. So Leclerc, another great job. And actually, Sebastian Vettel, I think that's probably his best race of the season. A great comeback drive through the field. Like a lot of drivers, went backwards at the start, but really was able to look after those tyres much, much better than a lot of those other guys were in the midfield. Had a great fight with Kimi Raikkonen, and even had a couple of lockups in that fight with Raikkonen. It didn't really matter, and that point today, though it's only a point, though he still probably can't wait for these final 5 races, I feel that's a really big point today for Sebastian Vettel. That sounds so weird to say for a 4-time world champion, but you know what I mean. A good race from Seb today. AlphaTauri, I suppose, are up next with Pierre Gasly. Another ridiculously good race. So many overtakes, starting in 9th. At one stage, despite the fact he was looking after those soft tyres so well, managed to make overtakes. About halfway through the Grand Prix, started to go backwards, but obviously was looking after those tyres much better than, again, those guys around him in the final phase of the Grand Prix. His tyres still had the life. It's why I talk about strategy so much. I think it's so fascinating, the mind games that these drivers play, and Gasly played it perfectly today. Sacrificed that mid-stage to capitalise at the end. Passed Perez with 2 laps to go. A 5th place. Magical for that team that really are the 7th best car on the grid. Maybe 6th, depending on where you place Ferrari. But a really good drive from Pierre Gasly. And you just wonder, what more does he need to do to prove to Red Bull or any other team out there that he really is the real deal? Danny Kvyat 19th. I didn't realise he finished 19th until I started recording and still I started doing my graphics after the Grand Prix, because his race was so quiet. In that back group with the Hasses, with the Alfa Romeos, got a 5-second penalty. I'm not too sure if he did a second stop late on, trying to do something a little bit different, but a disappointing day from Danny Kvyat, another driver who's getting increased pressure about his future in Formula 1. McLaren, mixed fortunes for both their drivers, and actually just all the way through the Grand Prix, it's kind of bizarre that they've come away with a 6th place and a 13th place, because at one stage they were 1st and 4th. Carlos Sainz, apart from Kimi Raikkonen, had the best opening lap to the Grand Prix. So good. Overtaking 2 Mercedes is something you never expect to see, but with that light bit of rain in the air, we know all weekend the McLaren's been good in Sector 1, and that what was really paying dividends for both McLaren drivers. Norris managing to get up to 4th, and it was looking like it was going to be a magical day for the team. Surely a podium was going to come their way, but once the rain had cleared, once the majority of the cars had got their tyres up to temperature, the McLarens fell away. Carlos Sainz, solid Grand Prix, hanging in there in about 5th or 6th net position. Gasly managing to get past Perez with a couple of laps to go. Sainz managed to do it on the final lap. Not what he would have probably wanted after those first few laps of the Grand Prix. But Lando Norris, that's the part of McLaren that just really came apart today. Contact with Lance Stroll into turn 1. An almost carbon copy of Stroll and Verstappen from practice. The only difference was that Stroll was behind Norris, tried to do a cheeky move around the outside where there wasn't really space, and at one stage I was really thinking, my goodness, Lance, what an overtake. It's just he just didn't leave any space. Completely shut the door on Norris on the inside. Contact between the two ruined both their afternoon. Stroll deserving of the 5-second penalty, I believe. I think Brundle in commentary and Otmar Zafnauer said it was a racing incident, but you've got to be leaving space there. You really do. It's different in practice because it's practice and both of them were being stupid, fighting each other. But in a Grand Prix, you've got to leave racing room. Stroll did not do that. He came off poor anyway, so you can understand the frustration from his side and Racing Point side of things. But he destroyed Norris's race today. Norris couldn't get back into the fight, tried to do another pit stop late on as well to make something happen, got past George Russell in the closing stages, but what was looking so promising ended up with very little for Norris. And for Sainz, not too bad, now moving to the top 10 in the driver's standings, so a slight win there, but ultimately, 1st and 4th, I think they'll be a little bit disappointed on the end result. Racing Point, I suppose we've just spoken about Lance Stroll's Grand Prix really, but Sergio Perez, after making contact with Max Verstappen, what a drive to get back through the field. Proof that he deserves to be in Formula 1. Proof that he is one of the best in Formula 1. So consistent, so clinical. Some of the fights he was having, that one fight in particular with Esteban Ocon, oh my goodness, was I on the edge of my seat. We know these two have history. I was so convinced there was going to be contact. There wasn't. And actually we were treated to two cars, a rivalry that we have seen so many times in that midfield. And perhaps not a high-profile rivalry, but certainly one with plenty of history, side by side through the whole of Sector 1. Half of Sector 2 as well was really awesome to see. One of the best battles we have seen all season long. Sergio Perez, I feel, let himself down on that very late defensive move on Gasly with a few laps to go. You can understand why, because he had driven his heart off to get up to P5, P7 though, when you consider where he was at the end of lap 1. An incredible drive today from Sergio Perez. The two Renault guys, Ocon, that fight with Perez that I just mentioned was so good, and it was so great to see Esteban Ocon. I don't know about you guys, but he kind of has been in the shadow a little bit of this season, certainly in the shadow of his teammate, but just in the background, casually picking up points. Nothing too crazy, but today was that day where he really put himself on the map, and the way he was able to look after those tyres in that first stint was so good. I just feel for him that when he did eventually come in and put on the soft tyres, they were never able to get up to temperature because it was so late on in the race, and ultimately wasn't able to pass Perez, Sainz or Gasly. But the rest of the race I thought was really good from Esteban Ocon today. Exactly what he needed after those rumours about a week and a half ago that maybe Gasly would come in to replace Esteban. These are the kind of races he needs to do. Behind Ricciardo at the start, in front of him now. Ricciardo didn't have an awful race, was in that kind of midfield gaggle of cars that included Gasly, Sainz, Stroll, Norris at one stage, Vettel, Raikkonen. And the main strategy for that group of cars was nailing the timing of the pit stop. Ocon with the ultimate overcut. Ricciardo, the undercut really, he was the first to box, wasn't he? So 8th and 9th, this isn't a circuit that we thought would suit that car super well. Double points, not too bad. Sebastian Vettel we spoke about in the Ferrari section, so technically up next, Alfa Romeo. We're kind of moving into these final three backmarker teams now. The Alphas, the Williams and the Haas cars. And Raikkonen, that's one of his best races for a long time. Not only for that opening race, which was, again, just pure magic from Kimi Raikkonen. So good. All the way up to 6th place and behind Max Verstappen in an Alfa Romeo, despite starting all the way down in 16th place. He was still able to hold on throughout the Grand Prix. And I did not expect that. Raikkonen, he initially went backwards, but was able to hold his own, and for so long looked like he was going to be able to hold on to points. And I didn't expect that today. None of the others in those back three teams were anywhere close to points today. Russell gave it a good go at one stage, but after his pit stop, never really looked close. Whereas Kimi took the fight all the way to the end. And with about 5 laps to go, Seb eventually got past in his Ferrari. But Raikkonen proving he still got it. And whereas at the start of the season, I wasn't sure if Kimi's motivation was still there. I think today is proof that he is still good enough for Formula 1. And at 41 years of age, he can still do the business, even in the tricky car like the Alfa Romeo. Other drives that note in those back three teams, I just mentioned George Russell had a really good drive once again, pushing that Williams car to above and beyond what its pace is, fighting with Alex Albon at one stage, scrapping away with Norris as best he could in the closing stages as well, in front of that back group comfortably. Points kind of on the cards at one stage when a few of the cars at the front had stopped early, so if there was a safety car or if rain did come into play, I think Russell would have been rosy today. 14th at the checkered flag, he can be very proud of that. And the Haas boys, Latifi and Giovinazzi, very quiet races, and I think that's always a good sign of a solid Grand Prix when you don't really know what's happening with those back guys. Giovinazzi fighting with Grosjean, fighting with Magnussen, Latifi in there as well. Right then, there's no F2 this weekend, so before we go, let's take a quick look at your Drivers and Teams Championships, Driver of the Day and Race Rating. Lewis Hamilton, after that historic victory, extends his championship lead to 77 points, meaning he can be world champion for the 7th time next time out at Imola. Max Verstappen is still trying his best to close in on Valtteri Bottas. Daniel Ricciardo leads that fight for best of the rest, 5 points in front of Charles Leclerc, only 1 point back is Sergio Perez. Lando Norris sits in 7th place, his good friend Alex Albon in 8th, and Gasly with that 5th place today is now only 1 single point behind the Red Bull of Alex Albon. Carlos Sainz with that great drive today, leading the Grand Prix, moves into the top 10 on 59 points. A difficult race for Lance Stroll puts him in P11. Esteban Ocon picking up points today is P12. Sebastian Vettel trying to do a late charge in the standings, all the way down in P13. Danny Kvyat 14. Hulkenberg didn't feature this weekend, he's 15th. Giovinazzi, Raikkonen, Grosjean, Magnussen all score. Latifi and George Russell the only 2 yet to do so. Latifi in front of Russell thanks to his 2 11th places and countback. And in your constructors standings, there are no changes this weekend. Mercedes didn't quite wrap up the constructors standings, but it's very likely they will do so next time out at Imola. Red Bull comfortable in 2nd, Racing Point just hang on to 3rd place. They're only 2 in front of McLaren and 6 in front of Renault. Ferrari is 6th, AlphaTauri 7th, Alfa Romeo remain on 5, Haas on 3, and Williams the only team yet to score. And finally, before we go, let's take a quick look at Driver of the Day and Race Rating. Driver of the Day then. I really struggle with this one because there were so many good drives. Yesterday, I gave it to Georgie Russell in qualifying, but in the Grand Prix, I think I'm going to give it to Kimi Raikkonen. Drove the wheels off that Alfa Romeo car today. And in 2nd, I'm going to give it to Pierre Gasly, but huge shout out to the likes of Charles Leclerc, Max Verstappen, Lewis Hamilton, Sergio Perez. So many to choose from today, but Kimi, I think that was a very special drive from the Iceman. But my F1E drive of the weekend, pole position, race win by 25 seconds. It's got to be the history maker, Lewis Hamilton. What a weekend from the British driver. So close now to 7 world titles. And race rating then, I love it here at Portimao. I really do. I was so looking forward to it, and I really don't think it disappointed. Much better than the majority of Grand Prix this season. Action all the way through, strategy, intrigue, a fight at the front. Wasn't perfect. I'm going to give it an 8 out of 10. 7, 8, that kind of range, but I'm just going to give it an 8, especially when I take a look at some of the other races I gave a 7 to so far this season. And that about wraps up our race review, our quite long race review today as well, here at Portimao for round 12 of the season, the Portuguese Grand Prix. Fingers crossed we come back to this place. I absolutely loved it. I'd love to know your thoughts in the comments section down below. If you are new, feel free to subscribe. I hope you enjoyed today's race review and hope to see you all in the next one.